The rain had come down all morning, a slow drizzle that felt more like a curtain than a storm. It blurred the edges of the world, turning headstones into gray silhouettes and umbrellas into dark shadows. Margaret Ellison stood beneath her own black umbrella at the edge of the grave, the hem of her dress damp from the wet grass. 68 years of living, 43 of them married, and this was how it ended? With a casket sliding into the earth and her sons standing beside her, dry-eyed, impatient. She tried to cry. God knows she tried. But the tears wouldn't come. Maybe because it all felt too sudden. Maybe because something inside her refused to believe that Harold was gone. The accident had happened 2 nights before, on a rain-slicked road just outside of town. Harold's Buick had crossed the center line, the sheriff told her, and collided with a delivery truck. They said it was instant, that he never felt a thing. But Margaret had seen the car when they towed it to the impound yard. The passenger side was mangled, the windshield shattered. But the driver's side? It looked almost untouched. No blood, no airbag deployed. And yet, here they were, burying her husband. Her eldest son, Thomas, adjusted his tie beside her, glancing at his watch as the minister droned on about eternal life and resting in the arms of the Lord. Thomas always had that restless energy, the kind that made him a success in finance out in Boston. He'd flown in first class, rented a black Cadillac for the funeral, and reminded everyone, subtly, always subtly, that he was footing the bill. Beside him stood Daniel, her younger son. Daniel was softer, both in voice and in body, though he hid his insecurities behind polished charm. He had Harold's blue eyes, but none of Harold's grit. If Thomas was the mind, Daniel tried to be the heart, though lately Margaret had begun to feel that neither one of them had much room left in their lives for her. They called, yes. They visited sometimes. But everything about them, even now, felt calculated. "Mom," Thomas whispered, leaning close, "we should go. The storm's only going to get worse." The minister had barely finished his prayer. Margaret nodded numbly, lowering her umbrella and letting the cold drizzle kiss her face. She dropped a single white rose onto the casket as it was lowered into the muddy ground. The sound of wood striking wet earth echoed through her like a hammer blow. And then, as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her purse. Margaret almost ignored it. Who would text her at her husband's funeral? But something in her gut made her check. She fumbled the phone out, shielding the screen from the rain with her hand. One message. An unknown number. No name. No context. It read, "It's not me." Margaret froze, her heart hammered in her chest as if she'd just swallowed lightning. She read it again, certain her eyes had betrayed her, but the words were still there, just 3 chilling words. "It's not me." She felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She wanted to ask her sons if they had sent it, if it was some sick, unthinkable joke, but something stopped her. Instinct. She'd learned to trust instinct over the years. Thomas would scoff, call it a scam. Daniel would tell her not to worry. Neither would take her seriously. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her purse, her fingers trembling, and forced herself to walk with them toward the waiting cars. Back at the house, the casseroles had already started to arrive. That was the way of New England towns like theirs. Someone died and the neighbors showed up with food, as if tuna noodle or lasagna could plug the hole death left behind. Margaret smiled, accepted hugs, let people cry on her shoulder. She played the role of the grieving widow because that was what was expected of her. But her mind was a storm. She couldn't stop replaying that text. When the guests finally left and the house grew quiet, she locked herself in Harold's study. It still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the cedar polish he always used on the shelves. She sank into his leather chair, opened her phone, and stared at the message again. There was no signature, no clue, just a number with a Boston area code. Thomas lived in Boston. Could it be from him? No. He'd been standing right beside her when it arrived. Margaret's hand shook as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You know who. Don't trust them." Her breath caught in her throat. Don't trust them? Her son's voices drifted through the floorboards. They were in the kitchen, discussing the estate, arguing in hushed tones. She leaned closer to the vent to hear. "Shouldn't wait too long," Thomas was saying. "If we don't get her to sign over the account soon, the bank will lock everything down." Daniel murmured something Margaret couldn't catch. Thomas again. "She's fragile right now. We need to keep her focused on moving out of this house, not asking questions. Just play the grieving son, okay?" Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. The words blurred. The rain outside tapped against the windows like skeletal fingers. Her phone buzzed again. "He's alive." She dropped it. The phone clattered to the hardwood floor. Her husband? Alive? She wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream, but all she could do was stare at the tiny glowing screen, the words burning themselves into her memory. Alive. If Harold wasn't in that coffin, then who or what was she burying today? And if her sons knew something, why were they so eager to put him in the ground? The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a washed-out sky and the smell of wet earth. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee, listening to the murmur of her sons in the living room. Their voices rose and fell like waves, muffled through the old plaster walls. She hadn't slept, not a minute. Every time she closed her eyes, the message appeared. He's alive. It glowed in the darkness behind her eyelids, refusing to let her drift into rest. Now, in the gray light of dawn, the words carried even more weight. If Harold was alive, where was he? And why? Why in God's name would her own sons try to bury him? Her phone sat on the table beside her, face down. She wanted to pick it up, to demand answers from that unknown number, but some primal caution held her back. Whoever had texted her, they knew things. Enough to terrify her, yes, but maybe enough to keep her safe. She slipped the phone into her robe pocket just as Thomas entered the kitchen. "You should eat something, Mom." His voice was smooth, businesslike, as though he were already preparing for a meeting. "We've got a lot to go over today." Margaret glanced at him over her shoulder. "A lot?" "The estate, the house, Dad's accounts. It'll be easier to handle things now, while everything's still fresh." Fresh. The word tasted bitter. "I'd rather not talk about that right now," Margaret said softly. "Your father hasn't even been gone a week." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we need to. Banks don't wait, Mom. Neither do creditors. I've already scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor this afternoon. Daniel and I will take care of most of it, of course, but you'll need to sign some forms." She tightened her grip on the mug. "I said not now." For the first time, his polished mask slipped. Irritation flickered in his eyes, quickly smoothed over with forced sympathy. "Of course, I understand, but soon, Mom. Very soon." He rose, kissed her cheek mechanically, and left. Margaret sat frozen, staring into her coffee, her mind buzzing. Thomas's urgency wasn't grief, it was greed. And if he was this determined, what exactly did those forms entail? Later that morning, while her sons ran errands in town, Margaret slipped into Harold's study again. The air was stale with old tobacco, heavy with memory. She shut the door, turned the lock, and began searching. The desk drawers yielded nothing unusual, just tax forms, yellowed receipts, and Harold's collection of fountain pens. She checked the file cabinet, the bookshelf, even behind framed photographs on the wall. Nothing. Then she noticed the floorboard beneath the desk chair. It sagged ever so slightly when she stepped on it. Margaret dropped to her knees, pried at it with her fingernails, and felt the wood lift. Her pulse raced as she uncovered a shallow compartment. Inside lay a manila envelope, thick with papers. She pulled it out, sat cross-legged on the rug, and opened it. Inside were documents she didn't recognize.
"I'll think about it," she said evenly. Daniel smiled weakly, relief softening his face. "Good. That's good." As he turned away, Margaret noticed something tucked beneath his arm, a slim black folder. Her stomach twisted. The forms. That night, after her sons had gone upstairs, Margaret sat alone in the dark living room, the envelope from Harold's study hidden in her lap. She couldn't risk waiting. Whatever was happening, she needed answers, and not from Thomas or Daniel. She pulled out her phone, opened the mysterious thread of texts, and typed with shaking fingers. "If he's alive, where is he?" Minutes ticked by. She thought maybe this time there would be no reply. Maybe the silence meant she had gone too far. Then the screen lit up. "Follow the money. Look at the lake house." Margaret's breath caught. The lake house, their summer retreat in Vermont, unused for years. She remembered how Harold had insisted they never sell it, despite her son's constant urging. He called it their safe place, their escape. And suddenly, the word safe felt less like nostalgia and more like a warning. Margaret leaned back against the sofa, her heart pounding. If Harold was alive, if he was hiding, if the lake house was somehow part of this puzzle, then she was standing in the middle of a conspiracy larger than she could fathom. And the people she trusted most, her own flesh and blood, might be the ones trying to bury the truth, along with her husband. 2 days later, Margaret found herself behind the wheel of Harold's old Ford, the tires humming on the interstate as the Vermont hills rolled past. The house had grown unbearable. The constant watch of her sons, the endless talk of bank accounts, the folder that seemed to follow Daniel from room to room. She told them she needed space, a drive to clear her head. Thomas protested, of course, but when Margaret raised her voice, something she hadn't done in years, they backed down. Now the further she drove, the lighter she felt, though fear gnawed at her chest with every mile. The lake house had always been a place of laughter, barbecues, lazy summers on the dock. She and Harold had painted the shutters green together, arguing over who left more streaks. It was the last place she wanted to find secrets. By mid-afternoon, the narrow road opened to the familiar gravel drive. Weeds pushed through the stones, and the shutters sagged. The house looked smaller than she remembered, shrouded by trees that seemed to lean closer, listening. She killed the engine and sat for a long moment staring. Follow the money. Look at the lake house. Her phone burned in her pocket. No messages. Whoever had guided her here was silent now. She forced herself out of the car, gravel crunching beneath her shoes. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the lake just beyond the tree line whispering against the shore. She climbed the porch steps and tried the key she still carried on her ring. It turned. The door creaked open on stale air, thick with dust. The living room was just as they'd left it, worn sofa, fishing rods propped in the corner, a framed photo of Harold holding up a bass nearly as long as his arm. The sight of his grin nearly undid her. She closed the door softly behind her and began to search. The house was small, easy to sweep through. Kitchen drawers yielded only rusted utensils and yellow dish towels. Bedrooms held moth-eaten quilts, closets of old jackets. Nothing unusual. Then, in the back hallway, she noticed something strange. The rug was pulled slightly askew, the corner turned up. Margaret bent and tugged it aside. Beneath lay a trap door she'd never seen before, its handle new and gleaming against the warped floorboards. Her throat tightened. She gripped the handle, pulled. Hinges groaned, dust billowed, and a narrow stairwell yawned downward into darkness. Margaret hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct screamed to leave, to call the police, to flee. But she thought of Harold's letters, the FBI seal, the texts. If he was alive, if he was hiding, if the lake house was somehow part of this puzzle, then she was standing in the middle of a conspiracy larger than she could fathom. And the people she trusted most, her own flesh and blood, might be the ones trying to bury the truth, along with her husband. 2 days later, Margaret found herself behind the wheel of Harold's old Ford, the tires humming on the interstate as the Vermont hills rolled past. The house had grown unbearable. The constant watch of her sons, the endless talk of bank accounts, the folder that seemed to follow Daniel from room to room. She told them she needed space, a drive to clear her head. Thomas protested, of course, but when Margaret raised her voice, something she hadn't done in years, they backed down. Now, the further she drove, the lighter she felt, though fear gnawed at her chest with every mile. The lake house had always been a place of laughter, barbecues, lazy summers on the dock. She and Harold had painted the shutters green together, arguing over who left more streaks. It was the last place she wanted to find secrets. By mid-afternoon, the narrow road opened to the familiar gravel drive. Weeds pushed through the stones, and the shutters sagged. The house looked smaller than she remembered, shrouded by trees that seemed to lean closer, listening. She killed the engine and sat for a long moment staring. Follow the money. Look at the lake house. Her phone burned in her pocket. No messages. Whoever had guided her here was silent now. She forced herself out of the car, gravel crunching beneath her shoes. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the lake just beyond the tree line whispering against the shore. She climbed the porch steps and tried the key she still carried on her ring. It turned. The door creaked open on stale air, thick with dust. The living room was just as they'd left it, worn sofa, fishing rods propped in the corner, a framed photo of Harold holding up a bass nearly as long as his arm. The sight of his grin nearly undid her. She closed the door softly behind her and began to search. The house was small, easy to sweep through. Kitchen drawers yielded only rusted utensils and yellow dish towels. Bedrooms held moth-eaten quilts, closets of old jackets. Nothing unusual. Then, in the back hallway, she noticed something strange. The rug was pulled slightly askew, the corner turned up. Margaret bent and tugged it aside. Beneath lay a trap door she'd never seen before, its handle new and gleaming against the warped floorboards. Her throat tightened. She gripped the handle, pulled. Hinges groaned, dust billowed, and a narrow stairwell yawned downward into darkness. Margaret hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct screamed to leave, to call the police, to flee. But she thought of Harold's letters, the FBI seal, the texts. If he was alive, if he was hiding, if the lake house was somehow part of this puzzle, then she was standing in the middle of a conspiracy larger than she could fathom. And the people she trusted most, her own flesh and blood, might be the ones trying to bury the truth, along with her husband. I thought so. I thought this was another Gan the Menfield shoot up on all this highs. Fear flooded as Margaret journeyed through the expanse of stale and now darkened air particles encamped within the basement's unforgiving cave. The boards above her groaned as Margaret held her breath in the basement's suffocating dark. Dust tickled her nose, but she dared not move, not even to stifle the urge to sneeze. Every footstep overhead felt like a hammer blow, each creak sending a shiver down her spine. "Check the study," Thomas's voice carried, sharp, commanding. "She's been snooping. If she knows about the accounts, we're finished." A pause, then Daniel's quieter reply. "What if she didn't come here? What if we're chasing shadows?" "She's not as naive as you think. She's smarter than she lets on. If she found the envelope at home, she'll know to look here." Margaret's chest tightened. They knew. They knew she'd been digging. The photograph burned in her hand, Harold's face staring back at her. Proof. Hope. And yet also a target, because if she had it, then they couldn't let her leave. The floor creaked again, closer now. Footsteps thudded across the boards, and then silence. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Margaret froze, panic surging. Slowly, carefully, she pulled it free, shielding the screen with her palm. A new message blinked. "Stay hidden. Trust no one. Wait until they leave." The words steadied her pulse, if only slightly. Whoever was sending them had eyes on the situation, maybe even inside the house. But who? She tucked the phone back into her pocket and crouched lower, forcing herself to melt into the shadows. Upstairs, drawers slammed, cupboards opened and shut. The muffled murmur of her son's voices carried down through the vents, fragments of their argument bleeding into the silence. "The FBI. Dad never should have." "It doesn't matter. The money's ours now." "And Mom." A pause. Then Thomas's voice, cold, final. "She won't be a problem." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The sound of footsteps drew closer to the trap door. She clutched the photograph tighter, praying, willing herself invisible. The handle rattled, hinges squealed. A shaft of light pierced the dark. Daniel's voice drifted down, hesitant. "There's nothing here." Thomas's reply snapped back. "Check, now." For one heart-stopping moment, Margaret imagined her son's face appearing in the stairwell, his eyes locking on hers. She would see in them the truth she had dreaded, that her own flesh and blood had turned predator. But then, mercifully, Daniel muttered something under his breath and let the trap door fall shut. The echo rattled her bones. Minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, at last, the front door slammed and the gravel crunched with retreating footsteps. Engines roared to life, fading into the distance. Only then did Margaret allow herself to breathe. She crept up the stairs, every nerve screaming for silence, and eased the trap door open. The house was still, its stale air thick with menace. In the kitchen, the curtains stirred slightly, as though someone had been watching from the window only moments before. Margaret scanned the yard, empty, save for the rusted swings swaying in the breeze. She sank into a chair, clutching the photograph to her chest. Harold was alive. That truth was both salvation and danger. Her phone buzzed again. "You can't go home. They'll watch you now. Tomorrow, meet me at the dock, midnight. Come alone." Margaret stared at the message, her mind whirling. Whoever this was knew too much. Too much about her, too much about Harold, too much about her sons. And yet, she had no choice. She set the phone down on the table, staring at the photograph of Harold with the FBI agent. If he truly was alive, then tomorrow night might finally bring answers. Or it might bring the end. The lake was a black mirror under the crescent moon. The old dock stretched out into the water, like a finger pointing toward secrets, its planks warped and slick with dew. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she approached, each footstep a soft creak in the still night. Every instinct told her to turn back. Whoever had sent the messages could be lying, a trap, a test. But the photograph of Harold burned in her pocket, an anger dragging her forward. The night air smelled of pine and damp earth. Somewhere across the lake, a loon cried, its mournful call echoing through the dark. The sound set Margaret's nerves on edge, as though it carried a warning. She reached the end of the dock and stopped, the water lapping softly against the posts. Midnight. She checked her phone. The glowing numbers read 12:01. No one. Her breath fogged in the cool air. As she scanned the shoreline, shadows shifted in the tree line. The breeze stirred the reeds. Still, no figure emerged. She was about to step back when her phone buzzed. A new message flashed across the screen. "Behind you." Margaret spun, heart hammering. A man stood at the edge of the dock, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the hood of a dark coat. For a moment, the world stilled. The waves seemed to hush, the trees holding their breath. The man raised his head just enough for moonlight to catch his features. Not Harold. A stranger. Margaret's chest tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled something out, a small envelope, sealed and stamped. He extended it toward her. Margaret hesitated, every fiber of her body screaming danger, yet her hand moved, almost against her will, and took the envelope. The paper was rough, cold against her skin. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man leaned closer. His voice was low, hoarse, as though scraped raw. "Someone who doesn't want you dead." Before she could speak again, the man turned and melted back into the trees. Margaret clutched the envelope, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to chase him, to demand answers, but the night swallowed him whole. With shaking hands, she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A name, an address, a date. And beneath it, scrawled in urgent handwriting, "Harold waits. Trust no one." Margaret sank on the dock, staring at the paper under the pale moonlight. Her husband was alive. The messages were real. But if Harold was waiting, then so were the people who wanted him silenced. Margaret's footsteps echoed hollow on the gravel road as she left the lake behind. The trees loomed close on either side, their branches clawing at the night sky. She held the envelope tight against her chest, as though the paper itself could shield her. Every sound felt magnified, the crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, even her own breathing. But then she heard it, a second rhythm. Footsteps, light, careful, trailing hers by just enough to avoid detection. Her pulse spiked. She quickened her pace, her shoes scuffing against the stones. The footsteps behind her adjusted, matching. Margaret stopped suddenly. Silence. The woods held their breath. Then from behind, a twig snapped. Her heart leapt. She turned sharply, peering into the shadows. The path behind was empty, swallowed by darkness. But she knew someone was there, watching, waiting. Margaret forced herself to keep walking, resisting the urge to run. Running would draw them closer. Running would make her prey. The farmhouse lights finally flickered in the distance, a faint beacon through the black. Relief surged until she noticed the second glow. A pair of headlights. Her son's car. Panic jolted through her. She ducked off the road, slipping into the underbrush. The branches scratched her arms as she crouched low, clutching the envelope. The car slowed, its engine purring like a predator. Thomas's voice drifted faintly from the open window. "She has to be nearby. Keep looking." Daniel replied, uneasy. "Maybe she never came this way." "Don't be stupid. She wouldn't risk the main road. She's here." The car idled for a moment, headlights sweeping across the trees. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the brush, the beams burning across her face before sliding past. Finally, the car rolled on, tires crunching slowly over the gravel. Only when the night returned to silence did she crawl out from the brush. Her hands were scraped raw, her dress torn at the hem, but the envelope was still safe. She slipped around the back of the farmhouse, avoiding the front porch where the boards would betray her weight. Inside, the house was dark and still, too still.
She climbed the stairs quietly, every creak a dagger of sound in the silence. In her bedroom, she closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, chest heaving. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper again. The address written there was in a town 2 hours away. The date was 3 nights from now. And the name? It wasn't Harold's. It was Agent Keller. Margaret froze. The name was familiar. She had heard it whispered in her husband's old phone calls late at night when he thought she was asleep. Keller had been his contact, his shadow in the FBI. If Keller had left her this message, then Harold's survival wasn't the only secret at stake. The floorboard in the hall groaned. Margaret's head snapped up, blood running cold. A shadow moved just outside her door. Then, 3 soft knocks. She gripped the envelope tight, every muscle braced. A voice whispered through the wood, low and steady. "Mom." "Open the door." It was Thomas. But the way he said it, flat, deliberate, sent a chill through her that no mother should ever feel. Margaret pressed her back against the door, her breath shallow. Thomas's shadow stretched long beneath the crack, unmoving, patient. "Mom," he said again, quieter this time. "I know you're awake. Open the door." His tone was wrong, too controlled. Thomas had always been blunt, quick to frustration, never one for hushed words. This wasn't her son's voice. It was someone else's wearing his skin. Margaret forced calm into her voice. "It's late, Thomas. What are you doing outside my room?" A pause. Then, "We need to talk." Her fingers tightened around the envelope, hidden behind her. "About what?" "About Dad. About what you found." Margaret's stomach dropped. The words were too sharp, too exact. He wasn't guessing. He knew. She stayed silent, praying he'd reveal more. The floorboard creaked as Thomas leaned closer. His whisper slid under the door like smoke. "You don't understand what you stepped into. He isn't who you think he is, and if you keep digging, you'll end up buried with him." Margaret's pulse thundered. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Go to bed, Thomas. We'll talk in the morning." Another long pause. She could almost hear him smiling. Morning might be too late. Then, without warning, his footsteps retreated down the hall, slow, deliberate, as though reminding her that every creak of the house belonged to him. Margaret exhaled shakily and slumped against the door. The warning wasn't idle. Her sons were circling her like wolves, waiting for her to falter. She unfolded the paper again. Agent Keller. 3 nights. That was her lifeline. But how to get there without her sons trailing her? A sudden vibration made her flinch. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. One new message. Don't sleep. They'll try tonight. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. The house groaned in the wind, its familiar noises suddenly menacing. She could almost hear Harold's voice, reminding her of the safety plans he'd once drawn up when he still worked for the Bureau. Trust your instincts. Don't wait for proof. She slid a chair under the doorknob, ainsing her eyes fixed on the shifting shadows cast by the window. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than the last. And then, faintly, the sound of another door opening down the hall. Margaret gripped the envelope tight. The night was far from over. The hallway floor creaked again, closer this time. Margaret held her breath, her knuckles white around the envelope. Shadows slithered under the door as someone moved past. Slow, cautious, deliberate. Thomas, Daniel, or both. She dared not speak. Instead, she edged silently toward the dresser and tugged open the bottom drawer. Beneath a stack of folded sweaters, her hand closed around the cold metal of the flashlight Harold had given her years ago. Heavy, solid, the kind with enough weight to double as a weapon. She tightened her grip, pulse racing. The shadow paused outside her room. A whisper. She's awake. Margaret's blood ran cold. Daniel. A second whisper answered, sharper, commanding. Thomas. Not yet. Wait until she's tired, then we go in. Her throat tightened. They weren't just circling, they were planning. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on her chest. Every sound of the farmhouse, the ticking clock, the rattling window panes, the shifting beams in the walls, took on a sinister weight. Margaret moved quietly to the window. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. It squealed softly and she froze. Silence in the hallway. Then, the faint scrape of feet turning back toward her door. "Did you hear that?" Daniel murmured. Margaret's pulse thundered. She shoved the latch, eased the window open inch by inch, the night air rushing in, cool and sharp. Below, the ground seemed too far distant, the garden beds jagged in the moonlight. The doorknob rattled. Her body froze in panic. The chair wedged beneath it groaned under pressure. "Mom," Thomas's voice came again, low and steady. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Margaret swung one leg over the cell, gripping the frame with shaking hands. She could almost feel their presence on the other side of the door, pressing closer, waiting for her to break. Another rattle, harder this time. The chair scraped. With a final breath, Margaret pushed herself out. She dropped into the night, her body crashing into the damp earth below. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to crawl into the garden shadows. Above her, the window slammed open. Thomas's shadow leaned out, eyes scanning the yard. "Run," he whispered into the night, his voice calm, chilling. Margaret clutched the envelope to her chest and limped into the darkness, branches whipping her face as she disappeared into the woods. Behind her, the farmhouse lights flared on. The hunt had begun. Margaret stumbled deeper into the trees, her ankles screaming with each step. The woods were alive with sound, branches cracking underfoot, leaves whispering in the wind. But every noise blurred into one sharp reality. She was being hunted. Behind her, voices cut through the night. Thomas, steady and commanding. Daniel, wavering, but following. Fan out, she couldn't have gone far. The beam of a flashlight pierced the darkness, sweeping across trunks and brush. Margaret dropped low, crawling into the thicket, the envelope pressed tight against her chest. The paper crinkled like thunder in her ears. The light passed inches from her face before moving on. She dared not breathe. Thomas's voice called out again, closer now. "Mom, stop this. You don't know what you're carrying. Hand it over, and maybe you'll walk away." His words rolled with a chilling confidence, as though he wasn't chasing a mother, but cornering prey. Margaret forced herself forward, hands clawing through the damp earth and roots. She remembered the old hunting trail Harold used to take, the one that led to a ranger station a mile away. If she could reach it, maybe there'd be a phone, a car, a witness. A sudden snap echoed ahead. Daniel's footsteps directly ahead. Margaret froze. The boy's silhouette moved through the trees, flashlight trembling in his grip. He paused, his beam sweeping wildly. His voice broke into the silence. "Mom, please, don't make this worse." For a flicker of a second, Margaret almost believed him. The softness in his tone tugged at her. Her boy, the one who used to sneak into her room after nightmares, the one who once feared the shadows he now carried. But then Thomas's voice cut in, sharp as a knife. "Don't hesitate. If you see her, grab her. We can't let her reach Keller." Daniel stiffened. His flashlight steadied. Margaret swallowed hard and crawled backwards deeper into the brush. She couldn't let pity undo her. Not now. The forest seemed endless, every tree another obstacle, every shadow another threat. She stumbled on roots, bit back cries of pain, and pushed forward. Then, the faintest glimmer ahead. A light. Her heart leapt. The ranger station. But as she drew closer, a new sound ripped through the woods. The low growl of an engine, tires crunching over leaves, headlights flaring between the trees. Someone else was waiting at the station. Someone who knew she was coming. Margaret crouched low behind the tree line, her chest heaving as the station's faint light glowed just ahead. The sound of the engine cut deep into the silence, steady and controlled, not the frantic search of her sons. Whoever it was, they were early, too early. The vehicle rolled into view, an unmarked SUV, black and dust-smeared, its headlights dimmed. It stopped just outside the ranger station. The engine idled, then shut off. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out. Margaret squinted through the shadows, her breath frosting in the cool night. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat collar turned up against